Picture this. You walk into a boardroom at 24 years old, carrying a device that could save thousands of lives, armed with data that proves your technology works. And three investors in $1,000 suits look you in the eye and tell you your idea is nothing more than a glorified pill dispenser that will never scale beyond a college dorm room project. They dismiss you like you're a child playing with toys, not a biomedical engineer who spent 3 years perfecting precision healthcare technology. Fast forward 5 years. Those same 3 men are sitting across from you again. But this time the power dynamic has completely flipped. This time, you're not asking them for money. You're buying their entire company for $4.2 billion. This time, they're the ones hoping you'll say yes. My name is Jessica Chen, and this is the story of how the worst meeting of my life became the catalyst for building one of the most successful healthcare technology platforms in North America. How rejection from Sterling Capital Ventures led me to create MedPrecision Holdings, a company that now serves over 2 million patients and has fundamentally changed how medication management works in hospitals and homes across the continent. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just another entrepreneur success story. This is about what happens when people who should know better underestimate someone because of their age, their background, or their gender. It's about turning their limitations into your fuel. And it's about building something so undeniably successful that the people who once dismissed you end up begging to be part of what you created. The whole thing started in my grandmother's kitchen in Quincy, Massachusetts, watching the woman who raised me struggle with something that should have been simple: taking medication, following a schedule, staying independent after a stroke that changed everything about how her mind processed information. My grandmother, Lin Chen, immigrated to America from Guangzhou in 1967 with my grandfather, carrying nothing but determination and a recipe for dumplings that would eventually help them build a small restaurant in Boston's Chinatown. She was the strongest person I knew, someone who learned English by watching soap operas, and built a business in a country where people told her women like her didn't belong in kitchens that weren't their own. But watching her fumble with pill bottles, seeing her confusion when she couldn't remember if she'd taken her morning medications, witnessing the fear in her eyes when she realized her mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, that broke something in me. More than broke it. It ignited something. The medication errors weren't just inconvenient, they were dangerous. Skipping her blood thinner meant stroke risk. Double dosing her heart medication meant potential cardiac episodes. Every mistake could be life-threatening, and the existing solutions were pathetic. Pill organizers that required perfect memory. Smartphone apps that assumed elderly users were comfortable with technology. Reminder systems that didn't account for cognitive decline or physical limitations. I was in my 3rd year of biomedical engineering at MIT, specializing in medical devices and digital health integration. My professors talked about innovation like it was theoretical, but I was living with the consequences of healthcare technology that didn't work for real people in real situations. Every night I came home to Cambridge and saw my grandmother's medication routine, I knew there had to be a better way. Not just better, revolutionary. So I started building it. Not in some sterile lab with unlimited funding, but in my tiny apartment bedroom, surrounded by circuit boards and empty medication bottles, testing precision dispensing mechanisms until my roommate Sarah thought I'd lost my mind. She'd find me at 2 a.m, hunched over my laptop, running calculations for dosing accuracy and user interface design. The technology I was developing wasn't just another medication reminder system. It was a precision dispensing device that could be programmed by healthcare providers, monitored remotely by family members, and integrated with electronic health records to track adherence and outcomes. The device could prevent double dosing, ensure proper timing, provide visual and audio alerts, and even detect when medications needed refilling. More importantly, it was being tested by the person who needed it most. My grandmother became my first user, and within weeks, her medication management went from chaotic and stressful to seamless and reliable. She stopped forgetting doses. She stopped worrying about whether she'd already taken her pills. For the first time since her stroke, she felt confident managing her own healthcare. The data was incredible. Perfect adherence for 6 months. Zero dosing errors. Measurable improvements in her health markers, because her medications were working the way they were supposed to work when taken correctly and consistently. But I wasn't content with helping just one person. I knew the statistics. Medication errors kill over 125,000 people annually in the United States alone. Poor medication adherence costs the healthcare system over $100 billion every year. This wasn't just my grandmother's problem. This was a massive public health crisis that could be solved with the right technology. I spent months researching the market, studying competitors, analyzing regulatory pathways, building financial projections. Every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. There was a massive opportunity for precision medication management technology that prioritized clinical outcomes over convenience features. The existing players in the space were focused on the wrong things: consumer apps that gamified pill taking, basic dispensers that couldn't prevent errors, expensive hospital systems that weren't accessible for home use. Nobody was building technology that met patients where they were while providing the precision that healthcare providers needed. My advisor, Dr. Elena Martinez, had been following my work throughout my junior year. She understood both the technical innovation and the market potential. When I told her I was ready to pursue commercial development, she didn't hesitate. "Jessica, this could change everything about medication management. But you're going to need funding to scale beyond prototypes. Let me connect you with some people who specialize in healthcare technology investments." That's how I ended up with a meeting at Sterling Capital Ventures, a Boston-based firm that supposedly understood the healthcare innovation space. Dr. Martinez had worked with them before. They'd funded MedFlow, a patient monitoring platform that went on to be acquired for $800 million. They'd backed CardioSync, a cardiac device company that revolutionized heart rhythm monitoring. If anyone would understand the potential of precision medication management technology, it should be them. I spent 6 weeks preparing for that meeting. Market analysis showing the $42 billion medication management industry. Clinical studies from Johns Hopkins and Cleveland Clinic proving the correlation between adherence and outcomes. Financial projections that were conservative but showed massive scalability potential. User feedback from my grandmother and 15 other beta testers who were already using early versions of the device. I had a working prototype that demonstrated every key feature, precise dispensing mechanisms that had never failed in 6 months of testing, smartphone integration that family members and healthcare providers loved, data analytics that could track adherence patterns and predict potential problems before they became emergencies. Everything was perfect. The technology worked. The market need was obvious. The financial opportunity was enormous. I had clinical validation, user testimonials, and a clear path to FDA approval and insurance reimbursement. I was 24 years old, first-generation college student, granddaughter of immigrants, and I was about to pitch the solution to a problem that affected millions of people worldwide. I believed that passion, plus preparation, plus proof of concept equaled opportunity. I was wrong about that last part. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning in November. Sterling Capital's offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Boston's financial district, the kind of building where every surface reflected your own insecurity back at you. The lobby was all marble and intimidation, designed to make visitors feel small before they even stepped into an elevator. I arrived 20 minutes early, carrying my prototype in a sleek black case and my presentation loaded on a tablet. I'd practiced the pitch so many times that Sarah could recite the key points from memory. She'd help me rehearse responses to every possible objection, from regulatory concerns to manufacturing challenges to competitive positioning. The receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed Boston Harbor, where container ships moved slowly through water that reflected the gray November sky. The conference table was mahogany, polished to mirror finish, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Michael Sterling entered first, the founding partner whose name was on the building directory. Mid-50s. Silver hair, navy suit that fit perfectly because it was tailored perfectly. He shook my hand with the kind of grip that said he was used to being the most important person in every room. David Ross came in next, portfolio manager for healthcare investments. Younger than Sterling, maybe early 40s, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. He nodded politely, but didn't offer much beyond basic pleasantries. Jennifer Walsh rounded out the trio, the only woman partner at Sterling Capital. I'd researched her background extensively: Harvard MBA, 10 years at McKinsey, 3 successful exits in biotech investments. If anyone would understand the strategic value of what I was building, it should be her. They settled into their chairs across from me, tablets and coffee cups arranged just so, the kind of choreographed professionalism that venture capital firms use to establish dominance before conversations even begin. Behind them, the harbor view served as a constant reminder of the wealth and power that existed in this room. I should have noticed the way they exchanged glances when I started setting up my presentation. I should have paid attention to how Sterling kept checking his phone during my opening remarks. I should have recognized the subtle signs that they'd already made up their minds before I'd said a single word. But I was focused on the opportunity. I believed that good ideas backed by solid data would speak for themselves. I believed that people who specialized in healthcare innovation would recognize innovation when they saw it. I was about to learn how wrong belief could be. The presentation started smoothly enough. I walked them through the market problem with statistics they couldn't argue with. Medication errors affecting 30% of elderly patients. Hospital readmissions costing billions annually. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Adherence rates below 60% for chronic condition management. The human cost was staggering, and the financial impact was measurable. Then I demonstrated the prototype. The device worked flawlessly, dispensing precise doses according to program schedules, providing clear alerts for patients, sending updates to family members' smartphones. The interface was intuitive enough for elderly users, while sophisticated enough for healthcare providers who needed detailed adherence data. I showed them the clinical results from my beta testing. 94% improvement in adherence rates. 0 dosing errors over 6 months. Measurable improvements in health outcomes for users with chronic conditions. 3 beta testers had avoided emergency room visits that their doctors attributed directly to better medication management. The intellectual property position was strong. I had provisional patents on the dispensing mechanisms, the software integration, and the user interface design. The regulatory pathway was clear through FDA's Digital Health Innovation Action Plan. I'd already established relationships with 2 regional hospital systems interested in pilot programs. Financial projections showed a path to $50 million in revenue within 3 years, with gross margins above 70% once manufacturing reached scale. Conservative estimates put the total addressable market at $12 billion annually, with opportunity for international expansion once domestic market penetration was established. Everything was there: technology that worked, market need that was obvious, financial opportunity that was enormous, regulatory pathway that was defined, user validation that was measurable. But their faces told a different story. Sterling leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, expression politely skeptical. Ross was scrolling through something on his tablet, only half listening to my explanation of competitive advantages. Walsh was taking notes, but her body language suggested she was writing questions rather than observations. When I finished the presentation, the room was quiet for a moment. Not the good kind of quiet that comes from people processing impressive information. The uncomfortable kind of quiet that precedes rejection. Sterling spoke first, his tone measured and professional. "Jessica, the technology is certainly impressive from an engineering perspective. You've clearly put significant work into the development process. Adherence rates below 60% for chronic condition management. The human cost was staggering, and the financial impact was measurable." Then I demonstrated the prototype. The device worked flawlessly, dispensing precise doses according to program schedules, providing clear alerts for patients, sending updates to family members' smartphones. The interface was intuitive enough for elderly users, while sophisticated enough for healthcare providers who needed detailed adherence data. I showed them the clinical results from my beta testing. 94% improvement in adherence rates, 0 dosing errors over 6 months, measurable improvements in health outcomes for users with chronic conditions. 3 beta testers had avoided emergency room visits that their doctors attributed directly to better medication management. The intellectual property position was strong. I had provisional patents on the dispensing mechanisms, the software integration, and the user interface design. The regulatory pathway was clear through FDA's Digital Health Innovation Action Plan. I'd already established relationships with 2 regional hospital systems interested in pilot programs. Financial projections showed a path to $50 million in revenue within 3 years, with gross margins above 70% once manufacturing reached scale. Conservative estimates put the total addressable market at $12 billion annually, with opportunity for international expansion once domestic market penetration was established. Everything was there: technology that worked, market need that was obvious, financial opportunity that was enormous, regulatory pathway that was defined, user validation that was measurable. But their faces told a different story. Sterling leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, expression politely skeptical. Ross was scrolling through something on his tablet, only half listening to my explanation of competitive advantages. Walsh was taking notes, but her body language suggested she was writing questions, rather than observations. When I finished the presentation, the room was quiet for a moment. Not the good kind of quiet that comes from people processing impressive information. The uncomfortable kind of quiet that precedes rejection. Sterling spoke first, his tone measured and professional. Jessica, the technology is certainly impressive from an engineering perspective. You've clearly put significant work into the development process. There was a pause that felt loaded with implication. But let's talk about the real challenges here. This is essentially a sophisticated pill dispenser in a market that's already saturated with medication management solutions. The competitive landscape includes established players with significant market share and distribution advantages. I started to respond, to explain how our precision and integration differentiated us from basic pill dispensers, but Ross jumped in before I could make my case. The regulatory pathway you've outlined sounds straightforward, but FDA device approval is notoriously unpredictable. Class 2 medical devices require clinical trials, manufacturing quality systems, post-market surveillance requirements. That's not something a graduate student can navigate without significant regulatory expertise and capital investment. Walsh added her perspective, and somehow it stung more coming from the only other woman in the room. Jessica, you've done impressive work here, but the business model assumptions are optimistic. Insurance reimbursement for medication management devices is limited. Direct pay markets for healthcare technology are challenging. How do you plan to compete with solutions like PillPack that already have Amazon's distribution and logistics capabilities? I tried to address their concerns systematically. The differentiation strategy that prioritized clinical outcomes over convenience. The intellectual property portfolio that created competitive moats. The partnership opportunities with healthcare systems that wanted better patient outcomes. The regulatory advantages of building for medical device standards from day one, rather than trying to upgrade consumer products later. But I could see I was losing them. Their questions weren't aimed at understanding the opportunity. They were aimed at finding reasons why the opportunity didn't exist. Sterling delivered what felt like the final assessment. Jessica, you're clearly passionate and intelligent, and your engineering skills are evident. But this feels like a student project that's gotten out of hand. The healthcare device space is brutal. You're talking about FDA approvals, manufacturing at scale, insurance reimbursement negotiations, hospital procurement processes. That's not something someone with your experience level can realistically handle. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. Ross was already closing my business plan, hadn't even bothered to read the financial projections on the last page. Walsh was checking her phone, mentally moving on to the next meeting. Sterling's final words were delivered with the kind of patronizing kindness that made them hurt more than outright cruelty. We appreciate you coming in today. Your enthusiasm is refreshing. But we don't see a clear path to the kind of returns our investors expect. Maybe come back in a few years when you have more business experience and industry connections." I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. 20 minutes. That's how long it took them to dismiss 3 years of work, 6 months of clinical validation, and a solution to a problem that was literally killing people. "Did you even read the market analysis?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "The clinical outcomes data? We did," Sterling replied, standing up to signal the meeting was over. "And while the numbers look impressive on paper, the execution risk is simply too high for our investment thesis. The healthcare innovation space is littered with promising technologies that couldn't scale to commercial viability." They hadn't just rejected my idea, they'd rejected me, not because the technology didn't work or the market didn't exist or the financial opportunity wasn't real. They'd rejected me because I was 24 years old and looked like someone who should be taking notes rather than pitching billion-dollar opportunities. In the elevator down to the lobby, I stared at my reflection in the polished steel doors. First-generation college student. Granddaughter of immigrants. Young woman in a room full of older men who'd decided I wasn't ready for their world. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. The worst part was how predictable it felt. Another brilliant idea from someone who didn't look like their typical portfolio company founder getting dismissed without serious consideration. But as I walked out of that glass tower and into the cold November air, something crystallized in my mind. Sterling Capital hadn't just rejected my pitch. They'd revealed their limitations. They couldn't see past their preconceptions to recognize actual innovation. They were so focused on managing risk that they'd missed the biggest opportunity in medication management technology. Their limitation was about to become my advantage. What Sterling Capital didn't understand that November morning was that my idea wasn't born from academic theory or market research. It came from watching someone I loved lose pieces of herself every day because the healthcare system failed her in the most basic way possible. My grandmother Lynn had been the anchor of our family for as long as I could remember. When my parents worked double shifts at the restaurant they managed in Chinatown, she was the one who picked me up from school, helped with homework, and made sure I understood that education was the bridge between where we came from and where we could go. She spoke to me in Mandarin when she wanted to make sure I remembered my roots, and in heavily accented English when she wanted to prepare me for a world that wouldn't always be patient with people like us. After her stroke in my sophomore year at MIT, everything changed. Not just her mobility or her speech, which came back slowly through months of physical therapy, but her confidence in her own mind. The woman who had memorized dozens of traditional recipes without ever writing them down suddenly couldn't remember if she'd taken her morning blood pressure medication. The person who had navigated immigration, language barriers, and business ownership was now afraid to manage a simple pill schedule. I would come home from Cambridge on weekends and find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at 5 different pill bottles, trying to remember which ones she'd already taken and which ones she still needed. The confusion in her eyes was heartbreaking, but the fear was worse. She was terrified of making a mistake that could kill her, and equally terrified of asking for help that would mean admitting she couldn't take care of herself anymore. The existing solutions were insulting to someone with her intelligence and dignity. Pill organizers that assumed she would remember to fill them correctly every week. Smartphone apps that required her to navigate technology she'd never been comfortable with. Alarm systems that went off whether she was home or not, creating anxiety rather than solving problems. I started spending my free time researching medication adherence, diving deep into clinical studies about the correlation between proper dosing and health outcomes. What I discovered was staggering. Non-adherence to prescribed medications caused approximately 125,000 deaths annually in the United States. It was responsible for up to 10% of hospitalizations. The economic burden exceeded $100 billion yearly when you factored in emergency room visits, hospital readmissions, and disease progression that could have been prevented. But the numbers that really got my attention were the demographics. Elderly patients, people with multiple chronic conditions, individuals with cognitive impairments from stroke or dementia. The patients who needed the most help with medication management were the ones least likely to succeed with existing technology solutions. This wasn't just a market opportunity. It was a moral imperative. I had the technical background to build something better. My biomedical engineering program at MIT focused on medical device design and digital health integration. I'd completed internships at 2 major medical device companies, working on everything from cardiac monitors to insulin delivery systems. I understood both the engineering challenges and the regulatory requirements for bringing healthcare technology to market. More importantly, I had a test user who would give me honest feedback about what worked and what didn't. My grandmother didn't care about elegant user interfaces or sophisticated features. She cared about one thing: taking her medications correctly without having to worry about it every single day. So I started building the device she needed. Not in some well-funded laboratory with unlimited resources, but in my tiny apartment bedroom, using savings from summer internships to buy components and development tools. I spent countless nights hunched over circuit boards and microcontrollers, designing dispensing mechanisms that could handle different pill sizes and shapes while maintaining precise accuracy. The engineering challenges were significant but solvable, creating mechanical systems reliable enough for daily use over years, developing software that could interface with pharmacy databases and electronic health records, designing user experiences that worked for people with varying levels of cognitive function and technology comfort. But the real innovation was in the integration. Most medication management solutions treated adherence as an isolated problem, separate from the broader healthcare ecosystem. I was building something that could be prescribed by doctors, monitored by family members, and integrated with hospital discharge planning and chronic disease management protocols. The device I created looked deceptively simple from the outside, about the size of a coffee maker, with a clean white exterior that wouldn't look out of place in any kitchen. But inside, it contained precision dispensing mechanisms for up to 12 different medications, each controlled by algorithms that accounted for dosing schedules, drug interactions, and refill timing. The user interface was designed specifically for elderly patients: large, high-contrast display, simple audio prompts that could be customized for volume and language preferences, visual indicators that were clear even for users with vision impairments, physical buttons rather than touchscreen controls, because my grandmother's arthritis made precise touching difficult. But the real magic happened in the connectivity. The device could be programmed remotely by healthcare providers using secure web interfaces. Family members could receive notifications about missed doses or successful adherence through smartphone apps. Pharmacies could be alerted automatically when refills were needed. Emergency contacts could be notified if doses were missed for more than 24 hours. Most importantly, the system generated clinical-grade adherence data that could be shared with healthcare providers during appointments. Instead of asking patients to remember how often they'd missed doses over the past month, doctors could access precise records showing patterns, trends, and potential issues. My grandmother became my first real-world test case. Within 2 weeks of starting to use the device, her medication routine went from stressful and uncertain to completely reliable. She stopped worrying about whether she'd taken her pills. She stopped having to ask family members to check her medication schedule. For the first time since her stroke, she felt confident managing her own health care. The clinical results were remarkable. Perfect adherence for 6 consecutive months, 0 dosing errors, measurable improvements in her blood pressure control, because her medications were working exactly as prescribed. Her cardiologist noticed the difference during routine appointments and asked what had changed in her medication management routine. But I knew one success story wasn't enough to prove commercial viability. I needed broader validation to demonstrate that the technology could work for different types of patients with varying conditions and cognitive abilities. I reached out to other families in similar situations, starting with my grandmother's social circle and expanding through referrals from her healthcare providers. Within 3 months, I had 15 beta testers using early versions of the device. Patients with diabetes, heart conditions, and multiple chronic diseases. Ages ranging from 62 to 89. Various levels of technology comfort and cognitive function. The results exceeded my expectations. Adherence rates improved by an average of 94% across all users. 0 serious dosing errors. Significant improvements in health markers for patients with chronic conditions. 3 users avoided emergency room visits that their doctors attributed directly to better medication management. More importantly, the user feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Patients felt more confident about their health management, Family members experienced less anxiety about their loved ones' medication routines. Healthcare providers appreciated having accurate adherence data to inform treatment decisions. I documented everything meticulously. Clinical outcomes, user testimonials, technical specifications, manufacturing costs, regulatory requirements. I built comprehensive financial models showing development costs, manufacturing scalability, pricing strategies, and market penetration scenarios. The market opportunity was enormous. Over $42 billion annually in medication management, with most existing solutions focused on convenience rather than clinical outcomes. Regulatory pathways were well defined through FDA's Digital Health Innovation Action Plan. Reimbursement opportunities existed through Medicare and major insurance providers for devices that demonstrated clinical value. I had proof of concept, user validation, technical differentiation, intellectual property protection, and clear paths to market. Everything venture capital firms claim to look for in healthcare technology investments. What I didn't have was appreciation for how much bias could override evidence. Part 3. The ordinary world life before Sterling Capital felt full of possibility in the way that only comes when you're young enough to believe that good ideas automatically become successful realities. I was dividing my time between my advanced engineering coursework at MIT and my makeshift development laboratory in Cambridge, completely absorbed in the challenge of perfecting technology that could save lives. My daily routine had a rhythm that felt sustainable and purposeful. Mornings started with classes in biomedical device design and digital health systems, learning theoretical frameworks that I was simultaneously applying to real-world problems. Afternoons were spent in the university labs, working on my senior thesis while testing iterations of my dispensing mechanisms and user interface designs. Evenings belonged to my grandmother and the other beta testers who would become my informal advisory board. I would drive to Quincy 3 or 4 times a week, checking on device performance, gathering feedback about user experience, and fine-tuning algorithms based on real-world usage patterns. These weren't clinical trial subjects in some sterile research environment. These were people whose lives were genuinely improved by technology that worked the way it was supposed to work. My roommate Sarah had become accustomed to finding me at all hours surrounded by circuit boards, medication bottles, and laptops displaying lines of code that controlled dispensing schedules. She joked that our apartment looked like a pharmacy had exploded in an electronics store, but she understood the importance of what I was building. Her own grandfather had struggled with medication management after a heart attack, so she'd seen firsthand how devastating adherence problems could be. "You're going to change everything," she would say when she found me working at 2 in the morning, bringing me coffee and forcing me to take breaks that I never wanted to take. "This is going to help so many people." The validation from beta testers was intoxicating. Every week brought new success stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been hospitalized twice for medication errors before using my device, hadn't missed a single dose in 4 months. Mr. Thompson, whose family had been considering assisted living because they were worried about his ability to manage multiple prescriptions, was now completely independent with his medication routine. But the feedback that meant the most came from my grandmother, who had gone from fearful and confused about her pill schedule to confident and empowered about managing her own health. She would call me after her cardiology appointments to share her doctor's amazement at how perfectly controlled her blood pressure had become. "Dr. Kim wants to know what I changed," she would tell me, pride evident in her voice. I told her my granddaughter built me a robot nurse. The academic side of my life was equally fulfilling. My senior thesis advisor, Dr. Elena Martinez, had been following my work throughout junior year with increasing excitement about both the technical innovation and the market potential. She understood that I wasn't just building another student project. I was developing commercially viable technology that could revolutionize medication management for millions of patients. Dr. Martinez had industry connections from her consulting work with medical device companies and healthcare systems. She'd been part of several successful technology transfer projects that moved university research into commercial applications. When I told her I was ready to pursue funding for scaling beyond prototypes, she didn't hesitate to offer her support. "Jessica, this could fundamentally change how we think about medication adherence," she said during one of our weekly check-ins. The clinical outcomes you're demonstrating are better than anything I've seen in published literature. But you're going to need significant capital to navigate FDA approval and manufacturing scale-up. That's when she mentioned Sterling Capital Ventures. They specialized in healthcare technology investments, with a portfolio that included several successful medical device companies. They'd funded MedFlow, a patient monitoring platform that had been acquired for $800 million. They'd backed CardioSync, a cardiac device company that revolutionized heart rhythm monitoring and became the gold standard for cardiologists nationwide. If anyone will understand the potential of precision medication management technology, it's Sterling Capital, Dr. Martinez assured me. Michael Sterling has a reputation for recognizing breakthrough innovations before they become obvious to the broader market. The introduction felt like validation of everything I'd been working toward. Sterling Capital wasn't just any venture capital firm. They were specialists who understood the complexities of healthcare innovation, regulatory approval processes, and the long development timelines required for medical device success. I spent weeks researching their investment thesis, studying their portfolio companies, understanding their approach to supporting entrepreneurs through the challenges of bringing healthcare technology to market. Everything I learned reinforced my confidence that they would appreciate both the technical sophistication of what I'd built and the enormous market opportunity it represented. The preparation for my pitch became all-consuming in the best possible way. I refined my market analysis to demonstrate not just the size of the opportunity, but the specific ways my technology addressed gaps that existing solutions couldn't fill. I organized clinical data from my beta testing to show measurable outcomes rather than just user satisfaction surveys. I developed comprehensive financial projections that accounted for development costs, regulatory expenses, manufacturing scaling, and multiple revenue stream opportunities. Most importantly, I prepared for every possible objection or concern they might raise. Regulatory pathway questions, competitive positioning challenges, manufacturing complexity issues, reimbursement strategy considerations. I had thoughtful, data-backed responses for everything I could anticipate. Sarah helped me practice the presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly under any conditions. She played devil's advocate, asking tough questions about market penetration assumptions and competitive advantages. She timed my responses to make sure I could cover all essential points within their attention span, while leaving room for interactive discussion. "You're going to blow them away," she said after our final practice session. "They'd be crazy not to fund this." The confidence felt justified based on everything I'd accomplished and demonstrated. I had working technology that solved a real problem. I had clinical validation from actual patients who were achieving better health outcomes. I had intellectual property protection, regulatory clarity, and market opportunity analysis. I had the technical expertise to lead development and the business acumen to build a scalable company. Most importantly, I had something most entrepreneurs could only dream of: proof that my solution actually worked in the real world with the people it was designed to help. My grandmother's medication adherence had been perfect for 8 months. Her health markers had improved to the point where her cardiologist was considering reducing some of her medications because they were working so effectively. She had regained confidence in her ability to manage her own health care, which had restored her sense of independence and dignity. The night before my Sterling Capital meeting, I called her to let her know about the opportunity. "Tomorrow, I'm going to meet with investors who might help me build devices like yours for millions of people," I told her. "Good," she said simply. "Other people need robot nurses too." That conversation crystallized everything for me. This wasn't about impressing venture capitalists or building a successful startup. This was about scaling a solution that could prevent thousands of deaths and improve millions of lives. The technology was proven. The market need was obvious. The financial opportunity was enormous. I went to sleep that night completely confident that Sterling Capital would recognize what I'd built and want to be part of scaling it to reach everyone who needed it. I was about to learn that confidence and evidence aren't always enough when you're facing people who have already decided what success is supposed to look like. Part 4, The Catalyst. The morning of my Sterling Capital meeting started with the kind of November weather that makes Boston feel like the edge of the world. Gray sky pressing down on gray buildings, cold that cut through even the heaviest coats, and wind that turned umbrellas inside out before you could get from your car to any building entrance. I had chosen my outfit carefully. Navy blazer, white blouse, black slacks that struck the balance between professional and approachable. Conservative enough to be taken seriously, but not so formal that I looked like I was trying too hard to fit into their world. My grandmother had insisted on doing my hair the night before, styling it in a neat bun that she said made me look like someone who could run a company. Confidence starts with feeling like you belong, she had told me while working bobby pins into place. But belonging starts with knowing you deserve to be there. I arrived at Sterling Capital's building 30 minutes early, partly because I wanted time to settle my nerves, and partly because I'd learned that arriving early gave you opportunities to observe the environment and the people before formal interactions began. The lobby was exactly what I'd expected from researching Boston venture capital firms. Marble floors that echoed every footstep, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, and reception furniture that looked more like museum pieces than actual places to sit. The security desk required me to sign in and provide identification before receiving a visitor badge that would grant access to the elevators. The process felt more like entering a government building than a business office, which I interpreted as a sign of the serious, high-stakes nature of the work that happened on the floors above. I spent 20 minutes in the lobby studying the company information displayed on digital screens throughout the waiting area. Sterling Capital's portfolio companies, recent investment announcements, and profiles of their senior partners. The messaging emphasized their focus on transformative healthcare technologies and their track record of supporting entrepreneurs through the complex process of bringing medical innovations to market. Everything I read reinforced my confidence that they would appreciate what I'd built. Their investment thesis explicitly mentioned precision medicine, patient outcomes improvement, and digital health integration. My technology addressed all three areas while solving a problem that affected millions of patients and cost the healthcare system billions of dollars annually. When the receptionist called my name at exactly 9:50 in the morning, I felt ready for the opportunity that could change everything about my ability to scale the solution I'd developed. The elevator ride to the 14th floor gave me a few moments to review my key talking points one final time and remind myself that I belonged in this building as much as anyone else. The conference room where they directed me was intimidating in all the ways that venture capital firms design their spaces to be intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased Boston Harbor and made you feel simultaneously elevated and exposed. A conference table that looked like it could seat 20 people but was set for just 4, creating an intimate setting that somehow felt more pressure-filled than a larger presentation would have been. I used the few minutes alone in the room to set up my materials and run through my opening remarks one final time. The prototype device sat in its carrying case, ready to demonstrate the precision and reliability that set my technology apart from everything else on the market. My tablet contained the presentation that summarized months of research, development, and validation into key points that could be communicated clearly within their time constraints. Michael Sterling entered first, and his presence immediately filled the room in the way that only comes from decades of being the most important person in most professional situations. Mid-50s with silver hair that suggested distinguished experience rather than advanced age. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, his eye contact direct without being intimidating. Everything about his demeanor communicated competence and authority. "Jessica, thank you for coming in today," he said as he settled into the chair directly across from me. "Dr. Martinez speaks very highly of your work. We're looking forward to learning more about what you've developed." David Ross joined us next, introducing himself as Sterling Capital's lead partner for healthcare technology investments. Younger than Sterling, probably early 40s, with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was comfortable making decisions that affected millions of dollars and dozens of careers. His background included successful exits from 2 medical device companies and an MBA from Wharton that he mentioned within the first minute of conversation. Jennifer Walsh completed the trio, and her presence as the only other woman in the room created a dynamic I hadn't fully anticipated. I'd researched her background extensively. Harvard MBA, 10 years at McKinsey specializing in healthcare strategy, 3 successful biotech investment exits at Sterling Capital. If anyone would understand the strategic value of what I was presenting, it should be her. But as she took her seat and opened her tablet to what appeared to be prepared notes about my company, I realized that having another woman in the room didn't automatically mean having an advocate. Her expression was professionally neutral in a way that suggested she'd already formed preliminary opinions about my presentation before I'd said a single word. "We've reviewed the materials Dr. Martinez provided," Walsh said, "but we're excited to hear directly from you about your vision for the company and the market opportunity you're addressing." The setup felt positive. 3 accomplished investors with relevant expertise, giving me their undivided attention in a setting designed for serious business discussions. I had worked too hard and prepared too thoroughly to be intimidated by the magnitude of the opportunity. I opened with the problem statement that had driven every aspect of my development process. Medication errors killing over 125,000 people annually, poor adherence costing the healthcare system more than $100 billion yearly, and existing solutions failing the patients who needed them most. The statistics were stark enough to demand attention, but I followed them immediately with the personal story that had motivated my work. My grandmother's struggle with medication management after her stroke. The fear and confusion that existing solutions couldn't address. The need for technology that prioritized clinical outcomes over convenience features. Sterling, Ross, and Walsh listened attentively as I explained the technical innovation that set my device apart from everything else on the market. Precision dispensing mechanisms that had achieved 0 errors over 8 months of real-world testing. Software integration that connected patients, family members, and healthcare providers in a seamless information loop. User interface design that worked for elderly patients with varying levels of cognitive function and technology comfort. I demonstrated the prototype, showing them exactly how the device dispensed medications according to programmed schedules, provided clear alerts for patients, and transmitted adherence data to smartphone apps and healthcare provider platforms. The technology worked flawlessly, responding to every command with the reliability that had made it trustworthy for my grandmother and 14 other beta testers. The clinical results were impossible to dismiss. 94% improvement in adherence rates across all beta testers. 0 serious dosing errors. Measurable improvements in health outcomes for patients with chronic conditions. 3 emergency room visits prevented because patients were taking their medications correctly for the first time in years. But as I moved through the presentation, sharing user testimonials, market analysis, competitive positioning, and financial projections, I began to notice subtle changes in their body language that suggested the conversation wasn't going the way I'd expected. Sterling leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in a gesture that could indicate thoughtful consideration or polite skepticism. Ross divided his attention between my presentation and something on his tablet that seemed to be occupying increasing amounts of his focus. Walsh was taking notes, but her expression remained carefully neutral in a way that felt more protective than engaged. When I finished the formal presentation and invited questions, the response wasn't what I'd hoped for. "The technology is certainly impressive from an engineering standpoint," Sterling said, his tone measured and professional. "You've clearly invested significant effort in the development process, and the clinical results from your beta testing are noteworthy." There was a pause that felt loaded with implications I couldn't quite interpret. But let's talk about the broader market dynamics and competitive landscape. This space already includes established players with significant advantages in terms of distribution, brand recognition, and relationships with healthcare systems. Ross jumped in before I could respond to Sterling's concerns. "The regulatory pathway you've outlined assumes a straightforward FDA approval process, but Class 2 medical device clearance can be unpredictable and expensive. How do you plan to navigate the clinical trial requirements, manufacturing quality standards, and post-market surveillance obligations without the kind of regulatory expertise and capital investment that typically requires institutional support?" Walsh added her perspective, and somehow her questions felt more pointed than those from her male colleagues. "The financial projections assume rapid market penetration and premium pricing, but insurance reimbursement for medication management devices remains limited. Direct pay markets for healthcare technology face significant adoption barriers, especially among elderly populations who may be resistant to new technologies regardless of their clinical benefits." I attempted to address their concerns systematically, explaining the differentiation strategy that prioritized clinical outcomes over convenience features, the intellectual property protection that created competitive advantages, the partnership opportunities with healthcare systems that valued patient outcomes over cost minimization, and the regulatory pathway that had been. But their questions weren't aimed at understanding how I planned to overcome challenges. They were aimed at identifying reasons why the challenges were insurmountable. Sterling delivered what felt like their collective assessment. Jessica, you're clearly passionate and intelligent, and your technical skills are evident in what you've built. But this feels like an academic project that's outgrown its appropriate scope. The healthcare device industry is extraordinarily difficult to navigate successfully. You're talking about FDA approvals, manufacturing at scale, insurance reimbursement negotiations, hospital procurement processes, and post-market surveillance requirements. Those are challenges that require years of industry experience and substantial institutional resources. The room felt different suddenly, smaller and more closed than it had when I'd entered an hour earlier. Ross was already closing my business plan, clearly having made his decision before reviewing the financial projections that comprised the final sections. Walsh was checking her phone in a way that suggested she was mentally transitioning to whatever meeting came next on her calendar. "We appreciate you taking the time to present today," Sterling continued, standing up in a gesture that unmistakably signaled the end of our discussion. "Your enthusiasm for solving important healthcare problems is admirable, but we don't see a clear path to the kind of scalable returns our investors expect from early-stage healthcare technology investments." The rejection was delivered with professional courtesy, but it was absolute and final. No suggestions for how I might modify my approach to make it more appealing. No recommendations for other investors who might be better suited for my type of opportunity. No acknowledgement that the technology worked, or that the market need was real, or that the financial opportunity was substantial. "Maybe come back in a few years when you have more business experience and industry connections," Walsh added, her tone suggesting she was offering helpful advice rather than dismissing everything I'd accomplished. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. 3 healthcare technology investment specialists had just spent 60 minutes reviewing technology that solved a massive clinical problem, demonstrated measurable patient outcomes, and addressed a market worth billions of dollars annually. And their conclusion was that I wasn't ready to commercialize what I'd built, not because the technology didn't work, not because the market didn't exist, not because the financial opportunity wasn't real, but because I was 24 years old and didn't look like their typical portfolio company founder. "Did you even examine the clinical outcomes data?" I asked, my voice quieter than I'd intended but carrying an edge of disbelief that I couldn't suppress. "We did," Sterling replied, maintaining his professional demeanor even as he moved toward the conference room door. "And while the preliminary results look promising, translating small-scale beta testing into commercial viability requires execution capabilities that extend far beyond technical development." They were already mentally finished with our conversation, ready to move on to whatever occupied the rest of their Thursday morning. I gathered my materials, packed my prototype back into its carrying case, and shook hands with 3 people who had just rejected the most important work of my life without seriously considering its potential. In the elevator down to the lobby, I stared at my reflection in the polished steel doors and realized that Sterling Capital hadn't just rejected my technology or my business plan. They had rejected me as someone capable of building a successful healthcare technology company. But as I walked out of their building and into the cold November air, something crystallized in my mind that would change everything about what happened next. They hadn't rejected my idea because it was flawed. They'd rejected it because they couldn't see past their preconceptions about who was qualified to build successful companies in their industry. Their limitation was about to become my greatest advantage. Part 5. The Betrayal/Attack. The rejection from Sterling Capital wasn't just professional disappointment. It was personal assault disguised as business feedback, delivered with the kind of patronizing courtesy that made it hurt more than outright hostility would have. Walking out of their downtown Boston offices into the November cold, I replayed every moment of that meeting, analyzing each response and facial expression for clues about where I'd lost them. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd never actually had them to begin with. They'd made their decision about me before I'd opened my mouth, and everything that followed was just professional theater designed to let them feel good about dismissing someone they'd already written off. The drive back to Cambridge gave me 40 minutes to process what had just happened. And by the time I reached my apartment, disappointment had transformed into something much more powerful. Clarity about exactly how venture capital worked when you didn't fit their preconceived notions about successful entrepreneurs. Sarah was waiting for me with coffee and expectant eyes, ready to celebrate what she'd assumed would be good news. When she saw my expression, her face fell immediately. "They said no," she said, not really asking. "They said I wasn't ready," I replied, setting my prototype case down harder than necessary. "They said my idea was essentially a glorified pill dispenser in a saturated market. They said the execution risk was too high for someone with my experience level." Sarah stared at me like I'd told her the sun had decided to stop rising. "Are they insane? You have working technology. You have clinical results. You have users who love what you built." "None of that mattered," I said, finally understanding something that should have been obvious from the beginning. They looked at me and saw a graduate student playing with a hobby project. They couldn't see past my age or my background to recognize actual innovation. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. The worst part was how predictable it felt once I understood what had really happened in that conference room. Another young woman with breakthrough technology getting dismissed by older men who couldn't imagine that someone like me might know something they didn't. But the real betrayal was still coming. Over the next few days, I tried to process the Sterling Capital meeting as a learning experience rather than a devastating setback. Maybe their feedback about market saturation and regulatory complexity contained insights I should consider. Maybe I needed to refine my business model or strengthen my competitive positioning before approaching other investors. I spent the weekend reviewing everything they'd said, trying to identify legitimate concerns that deserved serious attention. The regulatory pathway for FDA approval was indeed complex and expensive. Manufacturing scale-up would require significant capital investment. Insurance reimbursement policies for medication management devices were still evolving, but every analysis led me back to the same conclusion. Their objections weren't based on fundamental flaws in my technology or market opportunity. They were based on assumptions about execution risk that had more to do with their perception of me than with objective assessment of what I'd built. Monday morning brought the first sign that my Sterling Capital meeting was going to have consequences beyond simple disappointment. Dr. Martinez called me into her office with an expression I'd never seen before, concerned and slightly embarrassed. "Jessica, I need to talk to you about something uncomfortable," she said, closing her office door behind us. I received a call from Michael Sterling on Friday afternoon. My stomach dropped before she said another word. He wanted to let me know that while your technology was impressive from an academic standpoint, he was concerned about your readiness for commercial development. He suggested that perhaps you should focus on completing your degree before pursuing entrepreneurial ventures. The words hit me like physical blows. Sterling hadn't just rejected my pitch. He'd called my academic advisor to express concerns about my priorities and judgment. He also mentioned that your presentations seemed to overstate the market opportunity and underestimate the regulatory challenges. Dr. Martinez continued, her discomfort with the conversation evident in her voice. He suggested that perhaps you would benefit from more industry experience before attempting to commercialize your research. I sat in her office trying to process the magnitude of what Sterling had done. It wasn't enough for him to reject my funding request. He decided to undermine my academic standing and potentially damage my relationship with the professor whose support had been crucial to everything I'd accomplished. "Dr. Martinez," I said carefully, "did he offer any specific evidence for his concerns about my market analysis or regulatory understanding?" She shook her head. "He spoke in general terms about the challenges of healthcare technology commercialization and the importance of realistic expectations for student entrepreneurs." The conversation revealed the full scope of Sterling's betrayal. He'd used his reputation and industry connections to plant doubts about my competence and judgment with someone whose opinion could affect my academic career and future opportunities. But that was just the beginning. Tuesday brought news that 2 other venture capital firms I'd been courting had suddenly gone cold. Firms that had expressed interest in preliminary conversations about my technology were now responding to my follow-up emails with polite but definitive rejections. "We've decided to focus our healthcare investments in other areas this quarter," one partner wrote. Perhaps reach out again once you've completed your academic program and gained some industry experience. The language was too similar to be coincidental. Someone had been making calls, sharing opinions about my readiness for commercial ventures, poisoning opportunities before I could even present my technology to potential investors. Wednesday brought the worst news of all. I received an email from the director of MIT's Technology Licensing Office, the department responsible for helping students and faculty commercialize research developed using university resources. Jessica, we need to schedule a meeting to discuss the intellectual property status of your medication management technology. Questions have been raised about whether your device development constitutes personal research or university-sponsored work that should be subject to institutional oversight and potential ownership claims. My blood ran cold as I read the message. Someone had contacted MIT's administration to suggest that my technology might belong to the university rather than to me personally. If the Technology Licensing Office decided that my device fell under institutional IP policies, I could lose control of everything I'd built. I immediately requested an emergency meeting with the TLO director, Dr. Patricia Williams, to understand exactly what questions had been raised and by whom. I can't reveal specific sources, Dr. Williams explained when we met Thursday morning, but concerns were brought to our attention about the use of university resources and facilities in your device development. We need to review your project timeline, resource utilization, and any potential conflicts between your personal commercial interests and your academic research obligations. The investigation would take weeks to complete. During that time, I would be prohibited from seeking additional investment, filing new patent applications, or making any commercial agreements related to my technology. Sterling Capital hadn't just rejected my funding request. They'd systematically undermined my ability to pursue alternative opportunities while simultaneously threatening my ownership of the technology I'd developed. Friday brought the final piece of evidence I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. Julia Kim, a friend from my biomedical engineering program, approached me after our advanced medical device design class with information that explained everything. "Jessica, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I think you need to know," she said, looking around to make sure no one else could hear our conversation. "My internship supervisor at Biotech Partners mentioned your name in a meeting yesterday. Biotech Partners was another Boston venture capital firm that specialized in healthcare technology investments. I'd planned to approach them after completing the Sterling Capital process." "What did they say?" I asked, though I already suspected what she was going to tell me. He said they'd received some informal feedback about a student entrepreneur who was shopping around a medication management device. The feedback suggested that the technology might be promising, but the founder was inexperienced and potentially difficult to work with. Julia looked uncomfortable delivering the message, but she understood why I needed to hear it. He didn't mention Sterling Capital specifically, but he made it clear that other investors had raised concerns about supporting student entrepreneurs who might not be ready for the challenges of building commercial healthcare companies. The picture was now complete. Sterling Capital hadn't just rejected my proposal. They'd launched a coordinated campaign to ensure that I couldn't find funding anywhere else in Boston's venture capital community. They'd called my academic advisor to raise questions about my judgment and priorities. They'd contacted MIT's administration to suggest that my technology might not legally belong to me. They'd reached out to other investors to share negative opinions about my experience level and commercial readiness. Sterling Capital had decided that I was naive and unprepared for commercial success, and they were determined to prove themselves right by systematically destroying my opportunities to prove them wrong. But as I sat in my apartment that Friday evening, surrounded by the device components and user feedback data that proved my technology worked, I realized something that Michael Sterling, David Ross, and Jennifer Walsh had failed to consider. They'd underestimated exactly how motivated someone becomes when they realize that the system isn't just indifferent to their success, it's actively working to ensure their failure. That Friday night marked the end of my belief that merit and evidence would automatically lead to opportunity. But it also marked the beginning of something much more powerful. My understanding that when systems are designed to exclude people like me, the solution isn't to try harder to fit into those systems. The solution is to build better ones. Sterling Capital thought they were protecting their industry from an unprepared graduate student who didn't understand how the real world worked. They had no idea they were about to learn exactly how the real world worked, when someone with nothing left to lose decided to rewrite the rules entirely. The weekend after discovering the full scope of Sterling Capital's campaign against me, I made a decision that would change everything about how I approached building my company. Instead of trying to convince venture capital firms that I deserved their investment, I was going to prove that I didn't need their investment at all. Saturday morning, I called my grandmother to tell her what had happened with Sterling Capital and the subsequent efforts to undermine my opportunities throughout Boston's investment community. "They said your robot nurse isn't good enough?" she asked, incredulous. "They said I'm not good enough to build a company around it," I clarified. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably preparing tea the way she always did when she needed to think through something important. "Jessica," she said finally, "in China, people told me women couldn't own businesses. In America, people told me immigrants couldn't succeed. But your grandfather and I built our restaurant anyway, one customer at a time, one good meal at a time." Her voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from decades of proving people wrong through persistent action rather than persuasive arguments. These men in expensive suits don't understand what you built because they never had to watch someone they love struggle with medicine bottles. They never stayed awake worried about whether their family was taking pills correctly. They don't know what problem you solved because it was never their problem. She paused, and I could hear the familiar sound of her setting down a teacup. "But there are millions of people like me who need what you built. Find them, help them. Let the men in suits figure out later that they made a mistake." That conversation crystallized something that had been forming in my mind throughout the week. Sterling Capital's rejection hadn't revealed flaws in my technology or market opportunity. It had revealed limitations in their ability to recognize innovation that didn't fit their preconceived notions about viable business models and qualified entrepreneurs. Their limitation was about to become my competitive advantage. Sunday, I started researching alternative funding models that didn't require venture capital approval. Crowdfunding platforms that specialized in healthcare technology. Government grants for medical device development. Angel investor networks that focused on women entrepreneurs and underrepresented founders. Bootstrap revenue strategies that could fund growth through early customer acquisition rather than speculative investment. What I discovered was an entire ecosystem of funding opportunities that existed parallel to traditional venture capital, designed specifically for entrepreneurs who didn't fit the standard profile that firms like Sterling Capital preferred to support. The National Institutes of Health offered small business innovation research grants for healthcare technology development. The Department of Health and Human Services provided funding for innovations that addressed health disparities and access issues. The National Science Foundation supported commercialization of university research through their Innovation Core program. More importantly, I learned about successful healthcare technology companies that had scaled without traditional venture capital. Companies that had built sustainable revenue models through direct customer relationships, strategic partnerships with healthcare providers, and reinvestment of profits into growth rather than external funding rounds. These companies had proven that venture capital wasn't necessary for success in healthcare technology. In many cases, it had actually been counterproductive, forcing entrepreneurs to prioritize rapid scaling over sustainable growth and short-term financial metrics over long-term patient outcomes. Monday morning, I walked into Dr. Williams's office at MIT's Technology Licensing Office with a comprehensive documentation package that definitively established my ownership of the medication management technology. I had maintained meticulous records from the beginning of my development process. Timestamps showing that initial concept development had occurred during summer break when I wasn't enrolled in courses or using university facilities. Receipts proving that all components and development tools had been purchased with my personal funds from internship savings. Email records demonstrating that my grandmother and other beta testers had been recruited through personal relationships rather than university resources. Most importantly, I had documentation showing that my academic coursework and thesis research were focused on theoretical frameworks for medical device design, while my commercial technology development had been entirely separate work conducted on my own time using my own resources. "Dr. Williams," I said, presenting my documentation in organized binders that demonstrated the professionalism Sterling Capital had claimed I lacked. I believe this evidence clearly establishes that my medication management device was developed as personal research outside the scope of university activities and therefore belongs to me under MIT's intellectual property policies. She reviewed my materials with the thoroughness that such determinations required, asking detailed questions about development timelines, resource utilization, and the relationship between my academic work and After 2 hours of review, she reached the conclusion I'd known was supported by the facts. Jessica, based on this documentation, it's clear that your device development constitutes personal research conducted outside university oversight. You retain full ownership and commercial rights to your technology. The victory felt enormous, but it was only the first step in reclaiming control of my commercial opportunities from Sterling Capital's interference. Tuesday, I submitted applications for 3 federal grant programs that could provide funding for clinical trials and regulatory approval without requiring venture capital investment. The Small Business Innovation Research Program through NIH, the Innovation Core Program through NSF. The Health and Human Services Innovation Challenge for Technologies Addressing Medication Adherence. Each application required extensive documentation of technology specifications, market analysis, competitive positioning, and development timelines. But unlike venture capital presentations, these applications were evaluated based on technical merit and social impact, rather than subjective assessments of entrepreneur readiness and team composition. Wednesday, I contacted Dr. Patricia Kim at Boston Medical Center, who had been following my research throughout my development process. She agreed to sponsor a formal clinical trial with 200 patients, which would provide the kind of rigorous validation that could support FDA approval and insurance reimbursement applications. Jessica, I've been waiting for someone to develop technology like this, she said during our meeting to discuss trial protocols. We see medication adherence problems every day in our practice, and existing solutions are inadequate for patients with complex needs. The clinical trial would take 6 months to complete, but the results would provide evidence that no venture capital firm could dismiss as preliminary or insufficient. Thursday, I reached out to Maria Santos, a healthcare industry veteran who had recently left her position as Vice President of Innovation at a major medical device company. I'd identified her through LinkedIn research as someone who might be interested in joining early-stage healthcare technology companies that prioritized patient outcomes over financial engineering. I've been following your work through Dr. Martinez, Maria said when I called to introduce myself and explain my situation. What Sterling Capital did to you is unfortunately typical of how this industry treats entrepreneurs who don't fit their standard profile. She agreed to meet for coffee to discuss potential collaboration on building a sustainable healthcare technology company outside the traditional venture capital ecosystem. Friday brought news that began to shift the momentum in my favor. The NIH Small Business Innovation Research Program had accepted my preliminary application and invited me to submit a full proposal for Phase 1 funding, $250,000 to support clinical trial completion and FDA submission preparation. More importantly, the acceptance letter validated my technology and market analysis in ways that Sterling Capital's rejection never could. Federal grant reviewers had evaluated my proposal based purely on technical merit and commercial potential, without the subjective biases that had influenced venture capital assessment. That weekend, Maria Santos and I met at a coffee shop in Harvard Square to discuss the possibility of building a healthcare technology company that could succeed without traditional venture capital support. The venture capital model works for some companies, Maria explained, but it often forces healthcare technology entrepreneurs to prioritize rapid scaling over sustainable growth. That creates pressure to cut corners on clinical validation and regulatory compliance, which ultimately hurts both patients and long-term business viability. She had 15 years of experience in healthcare technology commercialization, including successful navigation of FDA approval processes, insurance reimbursement negotiations, and hospital procurement systems. Everything Sterling Capital had claimed I couldn't handle without institutional support. I've been looking for an opportunity to build something different, she continued. A healthcare technology company that prioritizes patient outcomes over investor returns, that takes time to develop solutions properly rather than rushing to market with inadequate products. By the end of our conversation, Maria had agreed to join as co-founder and chief operating officer, bringing the industry experience and business development capabilities that could complement my technical expertise and product vision. Monday morning, I walked into Dr. Martinez's office with updates that completely changed the narrative Sterling Capital had tried to create about my commercial readiness and prospects for success. I wanted to let you know that MIT's Technology Licensing Office has confirmed my ownership of the medication management technology, I began. I've also received preliminary approval for NIH funding to support clinical trials and FDA submission. Her relief was visible. The concerns Sterling Capital had raised about my judgment and priorities had clearly been weighing on her, despite her confidence in my technical capabilities. Additionally, I continued, I've partnered with Maria Santos, former VP of Innovation at MedDevice Solutions, as co-founder and COO. We're building the company without venture capital support, using federal grants and bootstrap revenue to fund development. Dr. Martinez leaned back in her chair, a smile spreading across her face as she understood the implications of what I was telling her. Jessica, you've done exactly what I hoped you would do when I first connected you with Sterling Capital. You've proven that your technology is viable and your business acumen is sound. You just did it in spite of their assessment rather than because of their support. The conversation marked a turning point in how my academic advisors viewed my entrepreneurial activities. Instead of being concerned about distractions from my studies, they began to see my commercial development as validation of everything they'd taught me about innovation and problem-solving. Tuesday brought the first concrete evidence that my bootstrap strategy was working. Dr. Kim's clinical trial had enrolled 50 patients in its first week, with initial adherence data showing results consistent with my beta testing outcomes. Hospital administrators were already asking about procurement processes for implementing the technology throughout their medication management protocols. Wednesday, I received notification that my NSF Innovation Core application had been accepted, providing additional funding and mentorship for market development and customer discovery activities. The program connected entrepreneurs with experienced business advisors who could provide guidance on scaling technology companies without sacrificing focus on solving real problems for real people. Thursday brought news that felt like vindication for everything I'd endured since the Sterling Capital meeting. A journalist from Boston Business Review called to interview me about innovative approaches to healthcare technology development outside traditional venture capital funding models. We're writing a feature about entrepreneurs who are building successful companies through alternative funding strategies, she explained. Your story about developing medication management technology through federal grants and clinical partnerships represents exactly the kind of innovation we want to highlight. The article would be published in 3 weeks, just as my clinical trial results would be ready for initial analysis. Perfect timing for establishing credibility in the healthcare technology community, while demonstrating that Sterling Capital's assessment of my commercial potential had been completely wrong. Friday afternoon, I received an email that completed my transformation from rejected entrepreneur to validated innovator. The preliminary results from Dr. Kim's clinical trial showed even better outcomes than my original beta testing had achieved. 96% improvement in medication adherence across all patient types. 0 serious dosing errors. 15% reduction in emergency room visits among patients with chronic conditions. Average healthcare cost savings of $3,200 per patient annually. The data was irrefutable. My technology didn't just work in controlled testing environments with motivated early adopters. It worked in real-world clinical settings with patients who had diverse needs and varying levels of technology comfort. That evening, I called my grandmother to share the news about clinical trial results and everything I'd accomplished since Sterling Capital's rejection. The doctors at the hospital are amazed by how well your robot nurse works with their patients, I told her. They want to use devices like yours throughout their entire medication management program. Of course they do, she replied with the confidence of someone who had never doubted the value of what I'd built. Good ideas don't stop being good just because someone in a suit says they won't work. She paused, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably preparing dinner while processing everything I'd shared with her. Jessica, those men at Sterling Capital taught you something important, even though they didn't mean to. What's that? I asked. They taught you that you don't need their permission to build something great. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by clinical trial data, federal grant approvals, and partnership agreements with healthcare providers who understood the value of what I'd created. 6 months earlier, I had believed that venture capital approval was necessary for commercial success. Now I understood that the best path forward was the one I built myself, step by step, validation by validation, patient by patient. Sterling Capital thought they were protecting their industry from an unprepared entrepreneur who didn't understand commercial realities. Instead, they had motivated me to prove that their understanding of commercial realities was limited by their own preconceptions about who qualified for success. They had dismissed me as someone who wasn't ready for the challenges of building a healthcare technology company. I was about to show them exactly how ready I was by building something they could never have imagined. A company that prioritized patient outcomes over investor returns, that measured success by lives improved rather than dollars raised, that proved innovation could thrive outside their limited vision of what entrepreneurship was supposed to look like. The rejection that had felt like the end of my entrepreneurial dreams was actually the beginning of something much more important. My education in building companies that succeeded because they solved real problems for real people, not because they impressed investors who had never experienced those problems themselves. Sterling Capital's limitation was becoming my greatest competitive advantage. And I was just getting started. 2 years after Sterling Capital told me I wasn't ready to commercialize my medication management technology, I was sitting in the boardroom of Boston Medical Center, watching Dr. Patricia Kim present clinical trial results that would change everything about how hospitals approached patient medication adherence. The MedPrecision device has achieved unprecedented outcomes in our 2-year study, Dr. Kim announced to an audience of hospital administrators, insurance executives, and healthcare technology analysts. 97% medication adherence across all patient demographics. 89% reduction in medication-related emergency room visits. Average cost savings of $4,300 per patient annually. The room was silent as she clicked through slides showing data that pharmaceutical companies and hospital systems had been trying to achieve for decades. Perfect medication timing. Elimination of dosing errors. Measurable improvements in patient health outcomes. Dramatic reductions in healthcare costs. Most significantly, Dr. Kim continued, patient satisfaction scores show that the technology enhances rather than complicates their daily routines. Users report feeling more confident about their health management and more independent in their ability to follow complex medication regimens. I watched from the back of the auditorium as executives from 3 major hospital chains took notes and whispered among themselves about procurement timelines and implementation strategies. These weren't preliminary discussions about pilot programs. These were conversations about system-wide deployments that could affect hundreds of thousands of patients. Maria Santos, my co-founder and COO, leaned over to whisper in my ear. Boston General wants to place an order for 5,000 units. Mass General is talking about 10,000. This isn't just validation anymore, Jessica. This is market transformation. The clinical trial results had exceeded every projection I'd presented to Sterling Capital 2 years earlier. But the real transformation wasn't just in the numbers. It was in how the healthcare industry had begun to understand that medication adherence technology could be a clinical intervention rather than just a convenience product. Insurance companies were approving reimbursement for MedPrecision devices because the cost savings from prevented emergency room visits and hospital readmissions far exceeded the device costs. Medicare had fast-tracked coverage approval after reviewing our clinical outcomes data. Private insurers were creating new reimbursement categories, specifically for precision medication management technology. The FDA had granted our Class II medical device clearance in record time, citing the strength of our clinical evidence and the urgent need for effective medication adherence solutions. Our manufacturing partnerships were scaling production to meet demand that was growing faster than we'd ever anticipated. But the most satisfying validation came from patients themselves. My grandmother's robot nurse had evolved into technology that was transforming lives across North America. Elderly patients who had struggled with complex medication schedules for years were achieving perfect adherence within weeks of starting to use our devices. Families were reporting reduced anxiety about their loved ones' medication management. Healthcare providers were documenting improved patient outcomes across chronic disease categories. The success felt surreal, but it also felt inevitable. Not because the path had been easy, but because every step had been driven by solving real problems for real people, rather than impressing investors who had never experienced those problems. 3 months after Dr. Kim's presentation, I received a phone call that brought the Sterling Capital story full circle. Jessica, this is Michael Sterling from Sterling Capital Ventures. I hope you remember me. I almost laughed at the politeness in his voice, so different from the dismissive tone he'd used during our original meeting. Of course I remembered him. I remembered every detail of that November morning, when he'd told me my idea would never scale beyond a college dorm room project. "Hello, Michael," I replied, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I've been following MedPrecision's progress with great interest," he said, and I could hear the careful modulation in his tone that suggested he was working from prepared talking points. "The clinical results you've achieved are remarkable, and the market response has been extraordinary." There was a pause that felt loaded with everything he wasn't saying directly. "I'm calling because Sterling Capital is raising a new healthcare innovation fund, and we'd love to discuss potential investment opportunities with MedPrecision. We believe there could be significant synergies between your technology platform and some of our portfolio companies." The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The venture capital firm that had rejected my technology as commercially unviable was now asking to invest in the company I'd built without their support. "What kind of investment are you considering?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he would position an offer to a company that had already proven its market viability without venture capital funding. "We're prepared to offer a Series A investment of $100 million at a $500 million pre-money valuation," he said with the confidence of someone making what he believed was an irresistible offer. "That would give us the capital to accelerate your growth trajectory and expand into additional market segments." 2 years earlier, receiving a call from Michael Sterling offering a $100 million investment would have felt like validation of everything I'd worked to achieve. Now it felt like evidence of how limited his understanding had been when he'd dismissed my potential for commercial success. "Michael," I said carefully, "our most recent internal valuation is $2.8 billion based on current revenue multiples and market penetration projections. We're not looking for Series A funding." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. "I see," he said finally, and I could hear him recalibrating his entire approach to the conversation. "Well, if you're not interested in growth capital, perhaps we could discuss strategic partnership opportunities or eventual exit planning. Sterling Capital has extensive relationships with potential acquirers in the healthcare technology space." That's when I realized the full scope of the opportunity that was presenting itself. "Actually, Michael, I might be interested in discussing an acquisition," I said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "But not as the target company." Another long pause. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, though his tone suggested he understood exactly what I was implying. "MedPrecision has been evaluating acquisition opportunities to build a comprehensive healthcare technology platform," I explained. "We're particularly interested in companies that have strong technology but need better clinical integration and market positioning." What I didn't tell him was that Maria and I had been quietly researching Sterling Capital's portfolio for months. Their healthcare investments included several companies with promising technology that was underperforming in the market, because they lacked the clinical validation and patient outcome focus that had made MedPrecision successful. "We'd be interested in discussing the acquisition of Sterling Capital's entire healthcare portfolio," I continued, "along with employment offers for your investment team to help us integrate the acquisitions and identify additional opportunities." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined 2 years earlier. Michael Sterling, the venture capital partner who had once patronizingly suggested I come back when I had more business experience, was now trying to understand how seriously I meant my acquisition proposal. "Jessica, that would be a significant transaction," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Sterling Capital's healthcare portfolio represents investments of over $3 billion across 12 companies. "I understand the scope," I replied. "MedPrecision is prepared to offer $4.2 billion for the complete portfolio, including assumption of debt and employment contracts for key personnel. The offer was bold but carefully calculated. Sterling Capital's healthcare investments were underperforming relative to market benchmarks, partly because they lacked the clinical focus and patient outcome orientation that healthcare technology companies needed to succeed in an increasingly outcomes-driven market. More importantly, several of their portfolio companies would complement MedPrecision's core technology perfectly. A patient data analytics company that could enhance our adherence monitoring capabilities. A telehealth platform that could extend our reach into remote patient management. A pharmacy logistics company that could streamline medication delivery and refill processes. "I'll need to discuss this with my partners," Michael said, though his tone suggested the conversation had already shifted from whether the acquisition made sense to how quickly it could be structured. "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need. But I should mention that we're also evaluating other acquisition opportunities, so our timeline for major platform investments is somewhat compressed." 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the same Sterling Capital conference room where I'd been rejected 2 years earlier. Same mahogany table, same harbor view, same leather chairs. But everything else about the dynamic had completely changed. This time, I was sitting at the head of the table, presenting MedPrecision's integration strategy to Sterling Capital's senior partners. Michael Sterling, David Ross, and Jennifer Walsh were taking notes and asking questions about how their portfolio companies could benefit from clinical validation and patient outcome focus. The healthcare technology market has evolved significantly over the past 2 years, I explained, clicking through slides that showed market trends toward outcomes-based reimbursement and clinical evidence requirements. Companies that can demonstrate measurable patient benefits and cost savings have significant competitive advantages over those that focus primarily on convenience features or cost reduction. Maria Santos, now president of MedPrecision Holdings, presented the financial structure of our acquisition proposal. $4.2 billion for complete portfolio acquisition, with performance bonuses tied to successful integration and clinical validation of acquired technologies. "We're not just buying companies," Maria explained. "We're building a platform that can help existing technologies achieve their full potential by integrating them with clinical validation processes and patient outcome measurement systems." The due diligence process took 6 weeks. During that time, I had opportunities to meet with the founders and leadership teams of Sterling Capital's portfolio companies. What I discovered reinforced my conviction that the acquisition strategy was sound. These were smart people building promising technologies, but they were struggling to achieve market traction because they lacked the clinical validation and healthcare provider relationships that had made MedPrecision successful. They had been funded to build products rather than solve patient problems, which created misalignment between their capabilities and market needs. The acquisition closing took place on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 2 years and 4 months after my original Sterling Capital meeting. The signing ceremony was held in the same conference room where I'd been told my idea would never work, but this time local media was present to document what Boston Business Review called the largest healthcare technology acquisition by a bootstrapped company in Massachusetts history. "This transaction represents a new model for healthcare technology development," I told the gathered reporters and industry analysts. "Instead of prioritizing rapid scaling over clinical validation, we're building companies that prove their value through measurable patient outcomes before pursuing market expansion." Michael Sterling, who was staying on as Vice President of Strategic Investments reporting to Maria, spoke about the evolution of healthcare technology investment strategies. MedPrecision has demonstrated that patient-focused development can achieve both superior clinical outcomes and exceptional financial returns, he said. "We're excited to apply that approach across our entire portfolio." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The venture capital partner who had once dismissed my commercial readiness was now working for the company I'd built after his rejection. But the real satisfaction wasn't personal vindication, it was what we were building together. Within 6 months of the acquisition, 3 Sterling Capital portfolio companies had achieved FDA approvals they'd been pursuing unsuccessfully for years. Patient outcome data from integrated clinical trials was opening reimbursement opportunities that had been blocked by insufficient evidence. Revenue growth across the combined platform was exceeding projections by 40% quarterly. The success wasn't just financial. We were fundamentally changing how healthcare technology companies approached product development and market validation. Instead of building products and hoping they would solve problems, we were identifying patient problems and building technology specifically designed to address measurable clinical needs. A year after the acquisition, MedPrecision Holdings went public in an IPO that valued the company at $12.4 billion. The prospectus highlighted our integrated approach to healthcare technology development and our track record of achieving clinical validation for complex medical device technologies. My grandmother attended the IPO celebration at Boston's Four Seasons Hotel, wearing a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and carrying a small clutch purse that contained the original prototype device I'd built for her medication management. "I brought your first robot nurse," she told me during the reception, smiling as she showed me the device that had started everything. I wanted her to see what she grew up to become. The device looked primitive compared to the sophisticated systems we were now manufacturing, but it represented something that no amount of technological advancement could replicate: the understanding that innovation meant solving real problems for real people, not impressing investors who had never experienced those problems. During my keynote speech at the IPO celebration, I talked about the journey from rejection to acquisition, but I focused on the lessons that extended beyond any individual success story. 2 years ago, venture capital partners told me that my idea would never work because I wasn't ready for the challenges of building a healthcare technology company. I said to an audience of investors, healthcare professionals, and technology entrepreneurs. They were wrong about my idea, but they were also wrong about what it means to be ready for those challenges. I paused to look around the room, making eye contact with Michael Sterling, who was sitting at a table with other members of our strategic investment team. Being ready doesn't mean having all the answers before you start. It means being willing to find better answers when the ones you have aren't good enough. It means prioritizing the people you're trying to help over the people you're trying to impress. And it means understanding that the most important validation comes from patients whose lives are improved, not investors whose expectations are met. The applause was generous, but the real impact of that speech came in the conversations that followed. Multiple women entrepreneurs approached me to share their own stories of venture capital rejection and alternative path success. Healthcare professionals talked about technologies they'd wanted to develop, but hadn't pursued because they didn't fit traditional investment models. Most importantly, patients and their families shared stories about how MedPrecision technology had changed their daily lives. Perfect medication adherence that had allowed elderly parents to maintain independence. Elimination of dosing errors that had prevented emergency room visits. Improved health outcomes that had given families more time together. Those conversations reminded me why the Sterling Capital rejection had been a gift rather than a setback. If they had funded my original proposal, I would have been pressured to prioritize rapid scaling over clinical validation. I might have rushed to market with technology that worked but wasn't optimized for the patients who needed it most. Instead, their rejection had forced me to build something better. A company that measured success by patient outcomes rather than investor returns, that proved technology value through clinical evidence rather than marketing promises, that grew sustainably because it solved real problems rather than speculatively because it attracted speculative investment. The final validation came 18 months after our IPO, when the New England Journal of Medicine published a comprehensive study showing that healthcare systems using MedPrecision technology achieved 30% better patient outcomes across chronic disease management, compared to systems using traditional medication adherence approaches. The study included data from over 2 million patients across 400 healthcare facilities, making it the largest analysis of medication adherence technology ever conducted. The results were unambiguous. Precision medication management with clinical integration produced measurably better health outcomes while reducing healthcare costs. That evening, I called my grandmother to share the news about the medical journal publication. "The doctors who study medicine wrote about your robot nurse in their important journal," I told her. "Of course they did," she replied with the confidence of someone who had never doubted the value of what we'd built together. "Good ideas don't need fancy people to make them true. They just need time to prove themselves." She paused, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, probably preparing tea while thinking about everything that had changed since I had first started building devices in my apartment bedroom. "Jessica, do you remember what I told you after those men said your idea wouldn't work?" You told me that other people needed robot nurses too, I said, smiling at the memory. And now millions of people have them, she said simply. Sometimes the best thing people can do for you is tell you that your dreams are impossible. It makes you work harder to prove them wrong. That night, I sat in my office overlooking Boston Harbor, the same view I'd seen from Sterling Capital's conference room during that November meeting 3 years earlier. But now the harbor represented something completely different. Not the wealth and power that existed in venture capital buildings, but the endless possibilities that opened up when you stopped asking for permission to build something great. Sterling Capital had thought they were protecting their industry from an unprepared entrepreneur who didn't understand commercial realities. Instead, they had taught me the most valuable lesson of my career, that the best way to prove people wrong isn't to argue with them, but to build something so undeniably successful that they end up asking to be part of it. My medication management technology had grown from a device built for one grandmother into a platform serving millions of patients worldwide. The company they said would never scale beyond a college dorm room had become a $12 billion healthcare technology leader. The entrepreneur they dismissed as inexperienced had acquired their entire healthcare portfolio and transformed their investment approach. But the real success wasn't measured in dollars or market capitalization. It was measured in lives improved, families reassured, and patients empowered to manage their own health with confidence and independence. The technology worked exactly as I'd promised it would in that long-ago presentation. The market opportunity had been exactly as large as my analysis had projected. The clinical outcomes had exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Sterling Capital's rejection hadn't revealed flaws in my vision or execution capabilities. It had revealed limitations in their ability to recognize innovation that didn't fit their preconceptions about viable entrepreneurs and scalable business models. Their limitation had become my greatest competitive advantage. And sometimes, that's exactly how the world changes. One rejected idea at a time, built by people who refuse to accept that someone else's limitations define their possibilities. The investors said my idea would never work. They were wrong about everything except one thing. They would never work for anyone who thought the way they did. But they had no problem working for someone who proved that their way of thinking was exactly what the healthcare industry needed to change. 5 years after MedPrecision Holdings went public, I found myself standing at the podium of the Harvard Business School auditorium, looking out at 200 MBA students who represented the next generation of entrepreneurs and investors. The invitation to give the keynote address for their annual Healthcare Innovation Summit felt like the ultimate validation of everything I'd built, but it also carried the responsibility of sharing lessons that extended far beyond any individual success story. The auditorium was packed with students who looked remarkably similar to how I'd looked during my own graduate school days. Eager, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that good ideas combined with hard work would automatically lead to opportunity and success. I recognized that optimism because I'd once shared it completely, before learning that the world was more complicated than merit-based systems suggested. How many of you have been told that your ideas aren't ready for commercial development? I asked as my opening question. Nearly half the hands in the auditorium went up immediately, followed by scattered additional hands as students realized they weren't alone in experiencing rejection from investors, advisors, or industry professionals who had dismissed their innovations as premature or unrealistic. Keep your hands up if you were told the rejection was for your own good, to protect you from pursuing opportunities you weren't qualified to handle. Most of the hands remained raised, and I could see recognition spreading across faces as students connected their individual experiences to broader patterns they hadn't previously identified. Now keep them up if the person who rejected your idea was someone who had never personally experienced the problem you were trying to solve. The energy in the room shifted as students began to understand the point I was building toward. Almost every hand stayed up, and conversations started bubbling among classmates who were suddenly seeing their rejections in a completely different context. What you've just identified, I continued, is the fundamental limitation of traditional gatekeeping in innovation. The people with the power to approve or reject ideas are often the people least qualified to assess their value, because they've never lived with the problems those ideas are designed to solve. I spent the next hour sharing the complete story of MedPrecision's development, from my grandmother's medication struggles through Sterling Capital's rejection to our eventual acquisition of their healthcare portfolio. But I focused on the strategic and philosophical lessons rather than just the narrative satisfaction of proving skeptics wrong. Sterling Capital didn't reject my technology because it didn't work, I explained. They rejected it because I didn't look like what they thought a successful healthcare technology entrepreneur was supposed to look like. They confused their limitations with market limitations and their biases with business insights. The questions that followed were exactly what I'd hoped for: thoughtful, challenging, and focused on actionable strategies rather than inspirational platitudes. How do you distinguish between legitimate concerns about execution risk and bias-driven dismissal? Asked a second-year student who was developing mental health technology. Document everything, I replied. Legitimate concerns are specific, measurable, and focused on aspects of your technology or market strategy that can be addressed through additional development or evidence. Bias-driven dismissal is vague, personal, and focused on your qualifications rather than your innovation's potential. Another student asked about building companies without traditional venture capital, which led to a detailed discussion about alternative funding strategies and the advantages of bootstrap growth for companies focused on solving complex problems rather than achieving rapid scaling. Bootstrap development forces you to prove value before you scale, I explained. That's actually an advantage in healthcare technology, where premature scaling can lead to regulatory problems and patient safety issues that are much more expensive to fix than they are to prevent. The most important question came from a student who was clearly struggling with recent rejection. How do you maintain confidence in your vision when multiple experts tell you it won't work? The key is understanding the difference between your vision and your execution plan, I said. Your vision might be absolutely correct, while your execution plan needs refinement. Don't let criticism of your approach make you doubt the validity of the problem you're solving. I paused to make sure the distinction was clear before continuing. In my case, Sterling Capital was wrong about my vision but potentially right about some execution challenges. The solution wasn't to abandon medication adherence technology. It was to find better ways to develop and validate that technology. After the formal presentation, I spent another hour in smaller group discussions with students who wanted more specific advice about navigating rejection and building companies outside traditional investment frameworks. These conversations reminded me why speaking at universities was so important. Not because successful entrepreneurs owed something to the next generation, but because innovation required diverse perspectives that traditional gatekeeping often excluded. The most memorable conversation was with Jessica Chen, a first-year MBA student whose last name was purely coincidental, but whose background was remarkably similar to mine. She was developing assistive technology for stroke recovery patients, inspired by her grandfather's rehabilitation process after a cerebral hemorrhage. I've been told that the market for stroke recovery technology is too small to support venture-scale returns, she said during our discussion. But I know the technology works because my grandfather has been using prototypes for 8 months. How many stroke patients are there annually in the United States? I asked. About 800,000, she replied immediately, with average rehabilitation costs of $40,000 per patient and family support costs that aren't even measured in most healthcare economic studies. Her market analysis was thorough, her technology was validated, and her understanding of patient needs was deep and personal. She was facing exactly the same dismissal I'd experienced: rejection based on investors' limited understanding of market opportunity rather than objective assessment of technology potential. Maria, your challenge isn't proving that stroke recovery technology can work, I told her. Your challenge is finding funding sources that understand healthcare outcomes rather than just financial engineering. I connected her with 3 federal grant programs that specifically supported assistive technology development and introduced her to 2 angel investor networks focused on healthcare accessibility innovations. More importantly, I invited her to present her technology at MedPrecision's quarterly Healthcare Innovation Symposium, where she could connect with hospital rehabilitation directors who understood exactly why her solution was needed. 6 months later, Maria's stroke recovery technology received NIH funding for clinical trials and partnerships with rehabilitation centers in 4 states. She was following almost exactly the same alternative path that had allowed MedPrecision to succeed without traditional venture capital approval. The Harvard Business School presentation also led to an unexpected opportunity that brought the Sterling Capital story full circle in ways I never could have anticipated. 3 weeks after my keynote address, I received a call from Dr. Elena Martinez, my former MIT advisor who had originally connected me with Sterling Capital. She was now serving on the board of the Massachusetts Healthcare Innovation Fund, a state-sponsored initiative to support entrepreneurial development in healthcare technology. Jessica, we're restructuring the fund to focus more heavily on patient outcome validation and clinical evidence development, she explained. We want to move away from traditional venture capital models toward approaches that prioritize solving healthcare problems over generating rapid financial returns. The irony was perfect. Massachusetts was creating an entire funding framework based on the alternative approach that MedPrecision had pioneered after being rejected by traditional venture capital. We'd like you to serve as chairman of the fund's advisory board, Dr. Martinez continued. Your experience building successful healthcare technology companies outside traditional investment models is exactly the expertise we need to guide other entrepreneurs who might not fit conventional funding criteria. Accepting the advisory board position felt like completing a circle that had started with my grandmother's medication struggles and led through Sterling Capital's rejection to creating new pathways for healthcare innovation. But it also represented something larger: the institutionalization of lessons learned from challenging conventional gatekeeping in innovation. The Massachusetts Healthcare Innovation Fund became a model that other states replicated, creating alternative funding ecosystems specifically designed to support entrepreneurs who were solving real healthcare problems, rather than impressing traditional investors. Within 2 years, fund-supported companies were achieving clinical validation and market success at rates that exceeded traditional venture capital portfolios in healthcare technology. More importantly, the fund prioritized entrepreneurs from backgrounds that were underrepresented in traditional venture capital: women, minorities, first-generation college graduates, and people with personal experience of the healthcare problems they were trying to solve. These entrepreneurs brought perspectives that led to innovations focused on patient needs rather than investor preferences. The success of alternative funding models eventually caught the attention of traditional venture capital firms, including Sterling Capital, which began adapting their investment criteria to emphasize clinical validation and patient outcomes, rather than just rapid scaling and financial engineering. Michael Sterling, who had remained with MedPrecision Holdings as VP of Strategic Investments, became one of the most effective advocates for patient-focused healthcare technology development. His transformation from skeptical venture capitalist to champion of evidence-based innovation represented exactly the kind of industry evolution that was needed to support better healthcare solutions. Working with MedPrecision taught me that the best healthcare technology investments are the ones that solve problems investors don't personally understand, he said during a panel discussion at the Boston Healthcare Technology Conference. Patient outcomes data is more predictive of commercial success than financial projections, because healthcare providers and insurance companies increasingly pay for value rather than volume. The panel discussion was moderated by Jennifer Walsh, Sterling Capital's former partner, who had joined MedPrecision as Chief Strategy Officer after our acquisition. Her evolution, from skeptical investor to strategic leader in patient-focused healthcare technology, demonstrated how dramatically the industry was changing. The venture capital model that worked for consumer technology doesn't work for healthcare technology, she explained to an audience of investors and entrepreneurs. Healthcare innovation requires longer development timelines, more rigorous validation processes, and deeper understanding of clinical workflows than most traditional venture capital firms are equipped to support. These industry leaders, who had once dismissed my medication management technology as commercially unviable, were now advocating for exactly the development approach I'd been forced to pursue after their rejection. Their transformation validated not just my individual success but the broader principles that had guided MedPrecision's development from the beginning. The ultimate validation came during MedPrecision's 5th annual Healthcare Outcomes Conference, which had grown to attract over 3,000 healthcare professionals, technology entrepreneurs, and policy researchers from around the world. The conference showcased innovations from companies that had followed alternative development paths similar to MedPrecision's original approach. My grandmother, now 87 years old and still using the latest version of the medication management technology she had inspired, was the keynote speaker for the conference's opening ceremony. Her presentation, titled, "What Patients Really Need from Healthcare Technology," brought the audience to a standing ovation. My granddaughter built me a robot nurse because she paid attention to problems that doctors and companies weren't solving, she said, her voice strong and clear despite her age. The best healthcare technology comes from people who understand what it feels like to need help, not from people who think they know what help should look like. Her words captured everything I'd learned about innovation during the journey from Sterling Capital's rejection to building a $12 billion healthcare technology platform. The most important validation wasn't financial success or industry recognition. It was the knowledge that millions of patients were living better lives because someone had refused to accept that their problems were unsolvable. That evening, at the conference's closing reception, I found myself in conversation with dozens of entrepreneurs who were building healthcare technology companies using principles MedPrecision had pioneered: patient outcome validation, clinical evidence development, and sustainable growth rather than speculative scaling. These entrepreneurs represented the future of healthcare innovation, diverse, patient-focused, and committed to solving real problems rather than impressing investors who had never experienced those problems. They were building the kind of healthcare technology ecosystem that could have supported my grandmother's needs from the beginning, rather than requiring her granddaughter to innovate solutions that should have already existed. The conversation that meant the most came from Dr. Sarah Williams, whose company was developing cognitive assessment technology for early dementia detection. She had been rejected by 7 venture capital firms before receiving alternative funding through the Massachusetts Healthcare Innovation Fund. "Your story gave me permission to keep building even when investors said the market wasn't large enough," she told me. "Now we're helping detect cognitive decline 3 years earlier than traditional assessments, which gives families time to plan and patients time to make decisions about their own care." Her technology was saving relationships, preserving dignity, and improving end-of-life quality for thousands of families. The venture capital firms that had rejected her funding requests had missed the opportunity to support innovation that was literally changing how families navigated one of life's most difficult challenges. As I drove home from the conference that night, I thought about the path that had led from my grandmother's kitchen in Quincy to a global healthcare technology platform that was improving millions of lives. The journey had started with rejection from people who couldn't see past their preconceptions about viable entrepreneurs and scalable innovations. But that rejection had forced me to build something better than what traditional funding would have supported. A company that measured success by patient outcomes rather than investor returns, that proved technology value through clinical evidence rather than marketing promises, and that grew sustainably because it solved real problems rather than speculatively because it attracted speculative investment. Sterling Capital thought they were protecting their industry from an unprepared entrepreneur who didn't understand commercial realities. Instead, they had motivated me to prove that their understanding of commercial realities was limited by their own assumptions about who qualified for success and what innovations deserved support. The medication management technology they dismissed as a glorified pill dispenser had become the foundation for a healthcare platform that was transforming how millions of patients managed chronic conditions. The entrepreneur, they said, wasn't ready for business challenges, had acquired their entire healthcare portfolio and revolutionized their investment approach. Most importantly, the rejection that had felt like the end of my entrepreneurial dreams had actually been the beginning of something much more significant. Proof that innovation thrives when it's driven by understanding problems rather than impressing gatekeepers. And that the best way to change industries is to build solutions so undeniably valuable that skeptics eventually ask to be part of what you've created. The investors said my idea would never work. They were wrong about everything except one thing. It would never work the way they thought business was supposed to work. But it worked exactly the way healthcare technology should work, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.